PlayStation 5's blazing fast solid-state drive. I'm sure a lot of you remember this was a big talking point for Sony before the console came out, that they made this industry-leading SSD that was going to be a balance of revolution and evolution, not just for consumers, but also developers as well, and Sony made a lot of bold claims right before launch, so let's take a look back and see if all those claims were true about the PS5 SSD dream. Let's start with a more recent topic that's been a bit contentious. Sony finally dipping their toes into the world of PC gaming. The one angle here is that for the first time in PlayStation history, some of the company's most beloved IP are now finally playable natively on PC. Seeing games like God of War, Uncharted, Days Gone, Spider-Man all release on Steam. On their own, there's nothing particularly noteworthy about that. These were all PlayStation 4 games that in some cases got PS5 versions with comparable enhancements. But then there's Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, one of the few games that is a genuine PS5 exclusive, as in it's not on Xbox, it's not on PS3, and it's also not on PC. Except, yeah, it's on PC now. But this immediately came under fire because, like most new console launches, there is a few games in that first year or two that get cherry-picked to be the poster child for that new hardware, and Rift Apart is one of them for PS5, because Insomniac leaned directly into the SSD dream being sold by Sony to consumers and to developers themselves, which is important to remember here. I know these topics always boil down to, so-and-so company lied to consumers, they told us this and that, but the SSD dream is a design principle from Sony based on feedback from developers. This was part of the company's studio tours where the System Architect Mark Cerny did site visits to hear from teams all around the world and what they want out of a new console. The number one request was an SSD, and clearly Microsoft came to the same conclusion that this should be in the next cycle of consoles. It's just that Sony put more of their eggs into the SSD basket by prioritizing this part of the console more than Microsoft. Having said that, Rift Apart was billed as the game that lets you travel through rifts in time, where you get to experience all these wildly different environments on the fly without any disruptions or load times. We can even hear Insomniac Games creative director Marcus Smith talk about this during a promotional trailer for the game before PS5 even came out.
Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart is a game that utilizes dimensions and dimensional rifts, and that would not have been possible without the solid-state drive of the PlayStation 5. The SSD is screamingly fast. It allows us to build worlds and project players from one place to another in near instantaneous speeds.
So you can imagine the head turning when the PC version is announced and the bare minimum spec requirement still allows the game to be played with a traditional spinning hard disk drive and 8 GB of memory. While an SSD is recommended, it is playable without a blazing fast PS5 SSD. What gives? Well, notably, this PC port, which is done by PC specialist Studio Nexus Software, is the first game to implement Direct Storage 1.2, Direct Storage being the Microsoft solution to help games load substantially faster on PC. It's best used for NVMe SSDs, and it's just now starting to be adopted to bring PC games into this new era of ultra-fast loading. Nexus says with Direct Storage and letting the GPU handle decompression for Ratchet's high-quality assets, they were able to retain the game's fast and responsive texture streaming at high settings. But considering PC games have an expectation of running on a lot of different hardware configurations, Direct Storage can be used on SATA SSD or HDD, and so it is playing a role in Rift Apart being playable on PC, though there is another caveat. That minimum spec also has average performance at 720p 30 frames per second. And this is where, historically speaking, this gets not complicated, just that's how these things normally go. We get a new fancy console and a few games that are touted as big, shiny, and only possible on that new console, while conveniently ignoring that, yeah, it probably can ship on lesser hardware if some concessions are made here and there. And in the case of PC, well, yeah, any game can ship there. So in this situation, I'd argue it's just another case of trade-offs versus expectations, mixed with marketing that isn't malicious, but tries to sell you on the idea of a new experience that does require a new product. Rift Apart probably wouldn't be very exciting on PS5, or PS4 for that matter, if it was a 720p 30 frames per second game, right? The fast-loading textures are cool with the expectation that visually it still looks like a PS5 game. And well, my god does this game look gorgeous. It looks beautiful in fidelity mode, performance, and the 40 FPS mode for 120Hz displays. So seeing the game technically possible on PC under worse conditions isn't exactly the most shocking thing out there. Even then, we see using a standard HDD on PC for Ratchet does not deliver an ideal experience. Even at minimum spec, the game stalls during the rift sequences. But let's get back to the PS5's SSD dream and reference the Road to PS5 GDC talk. Well, it was meant for GDC anyway, but, 2020. This is where the system architect Mark Cerny laid out the goals for PlayStation 5 hardware. Let's go through them one by one and see if PS5 is so far making them a reality. The first one was ultra-fast boot, and Mark Cerny said,
"Back to the dream of the SSD. Here's the set of targets. Boot the game in a second.
I'm sorry, play that again?
Boot the game in a second.
Okay, now I think you all know the results here, but let me just do some testing and see how close we can get to that. Pretty good, but not a second, no. Yeah, that's a no. That is a big time no. Nope, no. This would also be a no. Nope, nope, not even close. Pretty good. Nope, nope, not close. This one was pretty close. Sorry, nope. This was a bold one, cold booting the game in a second. So not resuming from suspension, but launching the game entirely. Now I should mention, for a lot of titles, this varies with splash screens. Some let you skip, some don't, and most seem to require them the first time you launch the game, like PS Studio titles, after which they'll let you skip the animation, and they can be some of the quickest examples we have. This sort of goes back to a lot of the testing I've done for the activity cart system, where from start to finish, that in theory should be the fastest from a cold boot to gameplay. Those can be very fast when they do exactly what they claim to do, but no, we're not getting 1 second boot times. And honestly, unless you're a stickler for these kind of things, I'd say this is splitting hairs at best. PS5 boots games unbelievably fast. It's one of my favorite quality of life improvements we've seen this generation, and so while no, it's not a second, I'm pretty happy with it being mere seconds in a lot of cases, versus upwards of a minute or two on PlayStation 4. Next up is simply
no load screens.
Yeah, we absolutely have this. Now, it does vary a lot, especially when we consider what is a load screen or not. One may argue that if anything appears on screen for even a brief moment, then it is a load screen. But I lean more on the, if it's so fast I can't even read the loading screen tip, then it's not even their side. Or at least it's not going to feel like a load screen, I should say, because this goes into the next point, which is when it comes to loading, some developers simply design their games around this so you never get a traditional load screen. So when we look back at Jak and Daxter on the PlayStation 2, I suppose we can say that game is living the SSD dream, right? After you start the game, there's never a load screen. So if we're not talking about the underlying principles of game design and how they're choosing to load in assets, then in a lot of cases I'd say PS5 does this. We can see this for cross-generation titles easily, where the PS5 version gets that next screen ready in a second sometimes. Same goes for any moment that would require a load screen, like dying or fast travel. Years later, we've got plenty of games that have quick restarts from death, or fast travel that really is fast. I use this example a lot, but I just love how based on player position and what's sitting in memory, if you're fast traveling to something that's not too far away, it literally is instant. It just happens. Not for some kind of modest, small-scale game, but AAA budget games with high-quality assets, you're seeing this stuff. That's awesome. Next on the SSD dream list is ultra-high-speed streaming.
Design freedom, meaning no twisty passages or long corridors.
This is arguably the most important one, especially when looking at the broader discussion that takes place during this presentation. Mark Cerny goes into detail about this, and as we just mentioned, for decades developers have been designing games around loading bottlenecks. His Jak 2 example is great because the Haven City map is made around the player's speed and sight lines. Much of the city feels enclosed, and you're always driving around tight turns to uncover more of the map. That's just one example, but there's a lot more because that's just how this is done, unless a studio decides on this. The point is, the SSD dream here is that if it's so fast, it could almost act as a secondary pool of RAM, letting large sets of data to be streamed in much faster, thus removing the need for windy corridors or long elevator rides. So, have they achieved this? Right now, more than 2 years after launch, it's hard to say. No would probably be the easy answer here, but that's because we've seen so many cross-generation titles. When you still have to ship on PS4, then yeah, you can't design an entire project without considering your lowest denominator. Thankfully, speed benefits have helped these games though. God of War Ragnarok may still have the realm travel sequence, but it's 1, narratively tied to the game, and 2, so fast on PS5 that it's not really much of an issue if there's no dialogue serving the story. Something like Spider-Man demonstrates how player speed can be intrinsically tied to the fun factor. Insomniac spent a lot of time making sure they can nail the web swinging and the speed of it within the limits of the hardware on PS4. But with Spider-Man 2, we can already see the studio ramping up the traversal speed. One noteworthy example where we can see more clearly how the SSD can be transformative is the Dead Space remake. It's still principally a PS3 360 era game under the hood, and it is also available on Series S, X, and PC, but it's the advancements in storage solutions that have made a noticeable change in this remake. The tram sequence between levels is effectively gone, allowing the player to advance right away, and when it does come into use for moving around the world, it's so fast that you stay within gameplay, keeping control of Isaac, all the while the game visually still looks the way one would expect a PS5 or Series X game to look, without compromises. It's a small but tangible change that illustrates the headroom developers have now. Though it is worth mentioning, future games are probably still going to have long elevator rides, corridors, slowly moving through a crevice. These things are not always tied to loading. In a lot of cases, they aren't. They could very well be a squeeze sequence that's meant to funnel players into a certain area, maybe create a point of no return. Sometimes an elevator just needs to be an elevator. So, while the SSD is definitely there, offering high-speed loading, we just haven't seen enough current-gen exclusives to really evaluate it. And even then, squeeze sequences will always be a thing. We'll still have corridors, or tight, narrow passages. In terms of level design, they'll just be there because it contextually makes the most sense, instead of hiding a loading screen. So perhaps this will look different in a few years, but for now it would be safe to say studios are making use of the speed when and where they can. The next point Cerny made is deduplicate game data.
More game on the disk and more game on the SSD.
The context here relates to the seek times that were typical with a hard disk drive. If a game needs certain data, the hard drive spends time simply looking for the data on the platter before it even starts loading. So in the interest of speeding up the process, developers may duplicate commonly used assets, as explained by Cerny with the Spider-Man example. Things like mailboxes and news racks are repeated up to 400 times, whereas an SSD can just grab what it needs right away for loading. Combine this with PS5's Kraken decompressor on the I/O unit in the APU, and developers could, in theory, stop duplicating game assets and have more room for whatever they're trying to make. A good portion of this is more behind the scenes and not something consumers would notice or even be privy to, but what we can say is that this is sometimes noticeable with PS5 game sizes. Now, yes, modern games do have ballooning file sizes. There's no getting around the space requirements for some of these high-quality assets games have today, but cross-gen titles are yet again a good example of showing how the Kraken decompression allows PS5 games to be generally the same size as PS4, or in many cases smaller despite higher resolution textures. If you're buying a lot of digital games, then you get to see this right at the checkout screen. So whether it's the Kraken decompression or the lack of duplicating data, this was true to some extent on day one. The last bullet point for Mark Cerny's SSD dream is no long patch installs.
And finally, those patch installs go away.
I recall this being something people felt was false on day one because it left the impression that PlayStation 5 just wasn't going to have the install process anymore for patches. You know what I'm talking about. It's that process on PS4 where you've already downloaded a big patch, you think you're done, but then it spends a few seconds, sometimes a few minutes installing the patch, which can certainly be annoying, though nowadays this install process seems more discreetly baked into the download progress bar. But PS5 very much has an installing process itself, albeit one that is much, much faster, and there's a reason for that. What Cerny is referring to is how PS4 games take on patches in the first place. The patch is installed by copying over the entire game file again and replacing your old one. So rather than thinking you're only applying a few gigabytes of data, it's better to think you're deleting and reinstalling the full game again with the changed content. And this is why, if you have a nearly full PS4 hard drive, you might encounter an error where you can't install a patch despite the console showing you still have space left. You're getting this error because you don't have enough space for the patch and another copy of the game to apply the patch. It's a pain, but that's how PS4 has always done this. So when Cerny said,
with an SSD though, no seeks, so no need to make brand new files with the changes incorporated into them, which means no installs as you know them today.
He was right, PS5 will just apply patches without creating new files, so patch installs are generally much faster on PS5 and more convenient when you don't hit a wall of not having enough storage to apply a patch. Thank you so much for watching this video, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all in my next one. You take it easy.